we'll get started. But thank you to Thawanka for pumping us up with some hip hop music. So that and half a liter of coffee, and I'll actually be conscious. So welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. Before we get started, and this is an oncology themed and common sense themed medical grand rounds, which I'm looking forward to. Just a reminder for our CME day, which I mentioned this at the faculty meeting yesterday, but we're doing a Sherlock Holmes themed CME day where it's the interesting case of, and then you present the case. And ideally, if there's a collaboration with the family physician that we can bring in and have that person also participate in the presentation, that would be great. So it doesn't have to be the most complicated case you've ever seen, but it should have some twists and turns. And we need 3 more cases. You get 30 minutes to present your case. So yeah, in each specialty, I'm sure would have lots of interesting cases. So this would be the kind of thing that you might have thought of for case of the year, or maybe you presented it as case of the year at Medical Grand Rounds. So if you could let Jillian or Megan know if you come up with an interesting case, or if we're going to get like a little Sherlock Holmes hat and a pipe for you. So if you have some kind of like British detective fetish, we were happy to dress you up when you present your case. So think about that. Anyway, on to today. This is a talk that I'm looking forward to from Dr. Booth and Dr. Gyawali, and it's entitled A Common Sense Approach to Oncology. I think everyone here knows Chris Booth as a medical oncologist and health sciences researcher who's been heavily involved in doing evidence-based research using the ISIS database. And he's been committed for many years to pointing out gaps in quality and access to patient care in Canada in general and globally. And Dr. Bishal Gyawali, who some of you may not know, is an MD PhD. He's been here for 3 years, 2 years as a fellow, and then now a year as a faculty member. He's an associate professor in medical oncology and public health sciences, and he did his cancer policy fellowship at Harvard Medical School, and is an expert for the WHO Drug Advisory Panel in cancer. So the 2 of them are going to tell us about a return to common sense in oncology. And I was telling Chris, I'm sure he's now offended every second oncologist by implying they're not using common sense. So before the tomatoes start flying, we'll let Dr. Booth come up here and present his case.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning. Yeah, it's a privilege to be here, and especially to give this talk with Bishal. And so we're going to push some provocative topics today within our own field of oncology, but certainly I'm always curious, do other specialists and other disciplines have these same challenges and problems? So during the discussion, it'd be great to have reflections from cardiology, resp, and GI, and other areas of internal medicine to hear whether there are similar issues. We're going to start just by framing what we envision as the common sense revolution in oncology. I'm then going to speak about what we have in cancer, which is known as the value crisis in cancer care. And then I'm going to hand over to Bishal to give us some insights about how did we get into these problems? How did we get there? We'll shift to think about where is this going globally? And then Bishal is going to wrap up and tell us how to fix everything with solutions in the last couple of minutes. So Bishal and I have no relationships with the pharmaceutical industry, but we do notably have one very important conflict of interest, and you might have got a flavor of it as we came in. Thawanka was playing some Nepali hip hop to get people in the mood. And so we both really love momos. And so for those of you who don't know what momos are, these are Nepali dumplings, but with a twist. And so Bishal and I, with some colleagues, were recently teaching in Kathmandu, and went to the greatest momo restaurant in the world. And so I just had to say that if anyone wants to kind of impair our judgment, just give us momos, and then we'll probably start talking a lot less common sense. And here's a picture from us teaching. There was several of us from Queens meeting colleagues from Nepal, other parts of Asia and Europe, to teach a course in critical appraisal and critical thinking in medicine in general, but specifically oncology in Kathmandu. But speaking more seriously about another disclosure, these topics we're going to discuss can be uncomfortable, and we're going to push pretty hard on some of the challenges in our field. But I want to step back and just remember that the reason we do this is we care very deeply about the treatments that we deliver to our patients. And I think that's what this is about at the end of the day. There's some things in oncology we do very well, and there's some things that we're not doing well. And we need to fix that because our patients deserve and expect more. The way I conceptualize oncology, it's the delivery of compassionate care. I think that's probably true for any area in medicine. Our number one job is to deliver care. That might include treatments. Sometimes it doesn't. But if it involves treatments, it should be treatments that actually really help people and don't have trivial gains. So this is the piece that Bishal and I published earlier this year in Nature Medicine. Cancer treatment should benefit patients, a common sense revolution in oncology. And as Stephen's right, we do get some pushback on this because it implies that some of the things that we do are not common sense. And I would argue that some of the things in our field are not common sense, and that sometimes Bishal and I also lack common sense. But we'll try to navigate this with carefully. We're going to touch on issues of the delivery of care, education within cancer, and research and policy. Just by way of background, Bishal and I met through common friends about 5 years ago, and we actually wrote our first paper together before we ever met in person. And so he has a very interesting story, if you haven't heard Bishal's journey from Kathmandu to Japan, back to Nepal, to the UK, to Harvard, and then to Kingston. So it's a great movie we're going to write one day, from Kathmandu to Kingston. It's going to be kind of a musical theater, and I'm still auditioning for a part. But he was transitioning from Nepal to the UK to Boston when common people in our field kept saying, you got to meet Bishal, you got to meet Bishal. People say, you got to meet Chris, because we had this kind of shared view of things in our field. And so ultimately it was great to end up writing this piece. And we really share a lot of kind of common vision. And in fact, that's probably why we look so much alike. We have this striking resemblance physically as brothers in common sense oncology. Okay, the cancer value crisis. What it comes down to is we have 4 problems. We have dubious endpoints in our clinical trials. We'll touch on that. When we do observe benefits, they're often very small, so small effect sizes. Even when we find those things, sometimes we have to wonder, how much can we believe them? Because in clinical trials, there are sometimes flaws in the design that make it difficult to understand the internal validity of those observations. And then the elephant in the room is the staggering price of cancer medicines. So this is an older paper now, but the blue line shows the skyrocketing price of cancer medicines. We now live in an era where the typical new cancer medicine costs $150,000, $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 per year. This is not sustainable in any health system globally. It also is we have to keep in mind too, the magnitude of benefit associated with these therapies are often measured in weeks or a few months. So we have a big problem with this. It's explained away that this is the cost of research and innovation. That's a myth. It's not. The revenue returns on a new cancer medicine are 8, 10, or 12-fold what the R&D investment was. So that's a myth. There's other myths about high cancer prices we can get to later. So prices are skyrocketing. This is a piece of work led by one of our former residents here at Queen's, the legendary Joey Del Paggio. And so Joey worked with us to ask a common question, a practical question. In most aspects of our life, if we spend more money, we get a better product or we get something more. And so if Dr. Archer, wants a faster motorboat, he spends more money, gets a nicer motorboat. If Bishal wants, to have better dancing, he spends more money for a better dance teacher, and his dancing may or may not improve. But what we found here is when we asked whether this relationship applies in cancer medicine, we found that not only is there no relationship between how well the cancer medicine works and its price, if anything, we found the inverse, whereby the drugs with the smallest benefit have the largest price tags. I certainly don't have an MBA or degree in economics, but even I can tell that's a broken system that requires careful thought. This is another piece of work from pharmaceutical policy. So Dan Myers is now an internal medicine resident in Calgary. And we had a team of residents and students, including Kristen Wright, who's one of our own internal medicine residents here. We tortured them for like a year, going through financial statements for the 10 largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. This is really painful, right? These are like 800-page documents, really hard. 10 of those for 10 companies over 10 years. That's a lot of paper. So they read through this, and the question we had is the global pharmaceutical industry landscape shifting towards cancer? Each year, for each company, we classified the amount of their sales revenue that was for cancer medicines versus everything else. And you can see the orange curve here, the skyrocketing is this massive shift in the entire pharma industry towards cancer. There's been a 70% increase in sales revenues from cancer medicine. During the same time, sales revenues from other drugs went down 18%. So, this might be good news for oncology. It's arguably not good news for all the other diseases that are very important to treat. There's also risks because it shows you there's so much money and power at stake here in the cancer space that I think it contributes to some of the problems we have in our field. Just going to touch briefly on my favorite endpoint in oncology. This is the most dubious endpoint in cancer world, progression-free survival. This is something Elizabeth and Eisenhower and I wrote about 10 years ago as a bit of a red flag warning. And unfortunately, 10 years later, progression-free survival is the king of oncology. It's the most common endpoint we use. So what is it? Progression-free survival is a surrogate measure. The third word, survival, we get it, whether the patient is alive or not. But most events in a PFS composite of a clinical trial relate to tumor progression. And this is what would be considered meeting an endpoint that grows from that to that. Okay, just a 20% increase in the diameter or a new lesion. So, if you have a CAT scan that shows a tumor goes from this to this, that's a PFS event. And so these new drugs often do not show overall survival benefit. What they show is that it might take an extra 6, 8, or 10 weeks before that goes to that. And you don't need to be an oncologist to say, well, maybe the oncologist, oncologists don't get it. You don't need to be an MD to understand that having a tumor go from this to this may not help someone live longer or live better, especially when you're driving a lot of treatment on that basis. This is a piece of work, again, led by Joey and colleagues here in Kingston, showing that over the last 40 years, within the oncology randomized trial ecosystem, number one, you can see who funds clinical trials. We now live in an era where about 90% of oncology drug trials are funded by the pharmaceutical industry. And you can also see overall survival, which is what matters to patients, living longer and living better. That used to be the most important endpoint that was measured routinely. Now, the field has completely shifted for complicated reasons we can talk about later, and now progression-free survival is driving everything. So this is what Bishal told me he did routinely on the weekends in Nepal. And so he's like, Chris, what do you like to do? We climbed Mount Everest. And so I was like, he landed, and literally the first weekend he was in Canada, I was like, I have to do something impressive. I'm not going to take him to climb Mount Everest. So I took him ice fishing. This is honestly, he'd been off the plane for like 3 days. And we went out. And so first of all, Bishal did not know how to swim when he moved here. And so he was seeing ice and snow for the first time and feeling very uncomfortable walking out onto a frozen lake. And I've taken a few friends out on the lake who haven't swam before, and you can just see the kind of this unsteady gait. But he was quite happy when he caught a huge pike there. You can see, I'm pretending I caught it, but actually Bishal caught it there. So now this is Bishal's favorite pastime in Canada. 3 months. This is an important number in oncology. Before I tell you what it means, I'll say that our group and others have shown that the vast majority of cancer medicines which are now approved by Health Canada, the FDA, and the EMA have no evidence they improve overall survival. Zero. Okay? They do not improve overall survival. They improve the surrogate progression-free survival thing. But amongst those that do improve overall survival, this is the average gain. Okay? So in the last decade, we've clearly had some transformative cancer medicines that have really improved the outcomes for patients with cancer. They have big, big benefits. But in aggregate, you can see that those are, the exceptions floating in a sea of some pretty mediocre drugs. The average improvement is 3 months. And I don't want to minimize 3 months for any patients, but we need to remember those 3 months come at a cost for the patient. Clinical toxicity with side effects, financial toxicity for the patient, the family, and the health system. An emerging concept we've been writing about lately called time toxicity, which we'll touch on later. And this concept of the efficacy to effectiveness gap. And so that's something that our group and others have worked on, where we've shown routinely that clinical trial benefits and outcomes observed in studies, efficacy is always attenuated in the real world. Effectiveness is always less because patients are older, sicker, frail, more advanced disease in routine health systems. So if we have these modest gains in the context of a clinical trial, someone's living an extra 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, it's almost certainly half of that or a third of that or 60% of that in routine clinical practice. So I just want to touch on, before handing over to Bishal for a few minutes, some of these good concepts of these opportunity costs and trade-offs. So this is a piece, again, one of our former trainees, Adam Funditis, wrote about with us last year. Adam's now a medical oncologist with the BC Cancer Agency. Have we forgotten patients' time? So I'm just going to paraphrase here. Time spent pursuing cancer treatment in waiting rooms, emergency rooms, and chemotherapy unit is time that cannot be spent fishing, traveling, or visiting with loved ones. This trade-off becomes most pressing near the end of life when time is short and many treatments offer small benefits. This is something patients think about and care about, but until recently, the oncology world, we weren't really talking about, we certainly weren't measuring it. And so this is another piece Elizabeth and I wrote with an emerging star in University of Minnesota, Arjun Gupta, So we don't really quantify to patients, if you go on this treatment, how many days a week or a month are you actually going to be waiting for us in the chemo unit, or extra scans, extra biopsies? Patients want to know how and where they live their time. If they're going to live a long time and the treatment benefit is modest or large, the trade-off is probably small. But when life is short, these trade-offs become very important. So in light of these, before I hand over to Bishal, some of these problems with small treatment benefits and toxicity, there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs at the patient level with time toxicity. There is an existential acceptance that might be traded off if people are pursuing therapy. They may not be actually doing the things that they want to do as life comes to a close. There are research trade-offs. When we design these large mega trials to detect small benefits, we're using important resources, financial resources, but most importantly, patients. Patients volunteer to go on clinical trials. And we've done modeling where we can show you can answer 3 clinical trials for the price of 1 large mega trial and answer 3 questions and hopefully identify treatments with much larger benefits. As we all know, in our current health system, there are limited resources, and we trade off all the time inherently when we make decisions about which treatments we recommend and how we prioritize. And I think it's naive for any specialty to think they live in a vacuum and imagine that we can just carry on without any regard for health system value. This is a tension balancing between the patient's priorities, values, preferences, and then how we can balance health system allocation for the larger population and all patients. And then, of course, societal trade-offs. We get really big picture here. Chasing 6 weeks of progression-free survival, or climate change, or early education, or parkland, clean water. These are complex issues that we don't really talk about when we get in our little kind of subspecialty areas, but these are big conversations that need to happen. So now I'm going to hand it over to Bishal to tell us how we got ourselves in this mess.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's really good to be here. So I'd like to continue with the conversation that Chris started. He discussed about the trade-offs. But why should we even have these trade-off discussions if our drugs were really good, if they were really game changer as the media portrays them to be? Then we should not even be having these conversations. It would be straightforward decisions. As the media tells you, we have game changer drugs. There are 5 breakthroughs, remarkable results, eye-catching. Like, these are really exciting. But the reality is, these are misleading headlines. Why are some of our cancer drugs not delivering the promise? I'll discuss about 4 important points related to that. The trial design flaws, I'll go into some details of that. The role of experts, the role of media, and the role of education. So going back to our Nature Medicine paper on common sense in oncology, we identified several threats to evidence-based medicine practice in oncology. And we discuss about several issues related to how evidence-based medicine can be hijacked. And I use the word hijack, borrowing from John Ioannidis, because evidence-based medicine is supposed to inform our practice, but there are ways in which you can game the system and show that the RCTs themselves can give us inferences as to, showing that a drug that is not beneficial as beneficial, a negative result as positive. And I'll discuss some of those. So some of the trial design flaws are, especially with regards to oncology, as Chris mentioned, approvals. Our drugs are approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints and single-arm trials. And even in RCTs, the eligibility criteria are strict, and the trial population are not representative of our routine population that we see. The control arm of the RCTs is not the routine standard of care. And there are issues with crossover, post-protocol therapies, difference between clinically meaningful versus statistically significant results, the non-inferiority design, and how we can even use subgroup analysis to game the system. And these are the results. These are the reasons why drug approval does not necessarily equal to better outcomes. And I will not have time to discuss all of these points here, but these 5 points I want to discuss in a little more detail. So let's talk about drugs that are being approved on the basis of surrogate endpoints like PFS that Chris just mentioned. But I would like to highlight that this trend is increasing every year. But if we compare with the Canadian system with that of the US, we are doing far better. This is a paper that we published last year in which we compared cancer drugs approved by the FDA versus that are recommended by the Canadian Agency for Drug and Technology in Health for reimbursement. And as we can see here, 92% of our drugs were based on RCT versus 75% in the US. And 50% of our drugs had OS data versus 30% in the US. And the number of drugs approved on the basis of response rate was less than 10% in our case versus 35% in the US. So we are doing better than US, but still there are several gaps to be filled. And then the issue of patient population. Even when we are doing randomized trials, our patient population is not representative of the routine patient population that we see in the clinics. In this paper, we looked at 142 phase 3 randomized trials that led to drug approval. And when we checked the patient population versus the routine population using the CA database in the US, what we found was the participation of females in these trials was significantly low than what you would see in the routine practice. The participation of Black patients was significantly lower than what you would see in routine practice. Patients with hepatitis infections were less. Patients with controlled brain metastasis, only 1.6% of all the patients had a controlled brain metastasis. So we have significant underrepresentation of these pockets of population that we see in routine practice in the drug trials that lead to drug approval. And why does it matter? Why do we need our trial population to be representative of our routine population? Because it gives us misleading picture. I'll take this example from hepatocellular cancer. These are several trials in first line and second line of hepatocellular cancer treatment. And hepatocellular cancer is a bad disease with a very bad prognosis. The median survival is still quoted around 6 to 8 months in advanced hepatocellular cancer. But if you see here, the first two trials are in first line setting and the other trials are in second line setting. But if you look at the control arm are people who are getting placebo. Even patients who are getting placebo, even in second line, they are having a median survival of 8 months, 9 months. This means these are highly selected patient population. These are not your routine patients. As Chris Booth says, these are Olympian patients, patients who can even participate in Olympics. To give a more detailed example of the same, if we look at the sorafenib trial, the first trial here, this is the result of overall survival. Sorafenib had overall survival of 10.7 months, placebo 7.9 months. This was statistically significant, a difference of almost more than 3 months. But there was a very smart study done using real world data in the US. And in the real world data, what they found was the median survival with sorafenib was 5 months. So the median survival with the drug in the real world was less than the survival of placebo in the trial. So patients who were getting placebo in the trial were living longer than patients who were getting the drug in the real world. The third point is the control arm. So even if we have a properly done randomized trial, we need to look at the control arm and see whether the control arm is really appropriate. Is this the control arm that we would use in routine practice? And how we can game it, how we can game the system in 3 ways. One, by using a control arm treatment that has already been proven inferior in previous randomized trials. Second, by not allowing an effective drug to be used. And third, by using placebo or ineffective drug instead of an active comparator. I'll give an example. Inferior control treatment. So for patients with lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer with PD-L1 of 50%, pembrolizumab was proven as the standard of care in 2016. So pembrolizumab is the standard of care for patients with non-small cell lung cancer since 2016. But here is another trial called cemiplimab. It's a me-too version of pembrolizumab. It's also an immunotherapy like pembrolizumab. But this trial ran from 2017 after pembro was already proven up until 2020, and it used a control arm of chemotherapy. So the problem is, if patients were being treated in routine practice outside of the trial, they would have received pembrolizumab. They would not have received chemotherapy. But in this trial, the control arm was chemotherapy that was already proven to be inferior, with the sole goal of getting the drug approved, because they want the drug to be approved. If they had a control arm of pembrolizumab, it would not be better than pembro. So with the sole goal of getting the drug approved, this trial ran using an inferior control arm. And some people argue that if it is done in low and middle income countries, isn't it ethical? But we have several reservations about that, which we discuss in this paper, but I'll not be discussing that today. The other way in which control arm can be gamed is by not allowing an effective drug to be used in the control arm. So this is the trial of olaparib in metastatic breast cancer with BRCA mutation. The language of the trial says patients were randomized to receive either olaparib or single agent chemotherapy of the physician choice. That sounds good. The control arm is whatever the physician wants to use. But there is bracket there. Chemotherapy of physician's choice, and then it says capecitabine, eribulin, or vinorelbine. So they are giving 3 choices, but that choice specifically excludes platinum, carboplatin, which is supposed to be better for patients with BRCA mutation. So they are giving you choices, but limiting those choices and not allowing you to use the drug that has more evidence in this setting. And the third way is using a placebo control. Again, a trial of olaparib, this time in pancreatic cancer. In pancreatic cancer, we use chemotherapy. And if the patient is responding to chemotherapy, we usually continue the patients on chemotherapy. But in this trial, after 4 months of being on chemo, the trial randomized patients to receive olaparib or placebo. So that means for patients with advanced pancreatic cancer who were responding to chemo, we just stopped their chemo after 4 months and put them on placebo, which is not ethical. And no wonder there was difference in PFS, the first graph, progression-free survival improved because we just stopped the treatment in the control arm. But overall survival even then did not budge. Even then OS did not improve. OS is the only metric that matters? No. Quality of life also matters. What about quality of life? They said the quality of life was maintained. This is a fancy way in oncology of saying quality of life was not improved. So basically, we're talking about a drug that does not improve how long patient lives, how well a patient feels, but will cost more than $12,000 in US, almost 7,500 Canadian dollars in Canada, and has important side effects. So this is where we are. So who will control the control arm? I'm not cherry picking examples. It's rampant. Like I gave you some examples from breast, some from pancreatic cancer, but we have written about it. The first paper is about lung cancer. The second paper is about prostate cancer. This is happening everywhere. The other issue I want to talk about is statistical versus clinical significance. This is an important issue. I want to give an example. So this is the headline news. The FDA approves a drug called neratinib for metastatic HER2 positive breast cancer. And then once you see such news, there will be several experts who will say, oh, this is a fantastic day for our patients. We are doing a wonderful job. But we need to look into the data. We should not just read the headlines or listen to what people are saying. And I try to look what the data is that supported this approval. So apparently this approval was based on the NELA trial, phase 3 NELA trial. I went into that report to study, and I found that the median PFS was 5.6 versus 5.5 months. This is not a typo. This is the result. 5.6 versus 5.5 months, 0.1 month difference. That is like 3 days of difference. If some patients forgot their scan and came 1 week later, you'll get 7 days difference. But this is significant. What can you do? This is statistically significant. Yes, it's 0.1 months, but the p-value, eureka, eureka, less than 0.05. But is this meaningful? Overall survival did not change, of course. By the way, this is the least PFS difference that I have ever seen in my life that is statistically significant. But this shows that if you enroll enough patients, you can get statistical significance, no matter how marginal the difference. But you know how the conclusion has been framed in this trial. They say, although a numerical difference favoring neratinib plus capecitabine was observed for OS, statistical significance was not reached. So when OS is not improved, so this is the way, like this is an example of spinning. This is how we can spin the results. So that's a big problem. And this is a problem that is not only with trials, that runs across our field. So I do not want to point out people's names, but the first is the screenshot of a tweet. So this is from a senior person in US. This is an actual tweet. So it says 6 years since I wrote the grant, 4 years, 15 months. Finally, I got a p-value of less than 0.05. It does not say about finally we changed this, finally we got the results, even if negative, we learned, but it's like, wow, finally we got a p-value. So this is our culture. This is what we have been teaching people. This is what we have been celebrating. This is what gets published. We all worship at the altar of p-value less than 0.05. And unless that system changes, we can't change the system. So let's go to subgroup analysis, the final point about trial design flaws. Again, an example from triple negative breast cancer, atezolizumab and immunotherapy. So this is the results. As you can see in the first result, in the intention to treat population, nowadays ITT population and poor protocol analysis has been in vogue since the colonoscopy results are published. Anyway, so in the intention to treat population, the p-value is not significant, as you can see, 0.08. But they did subgroup analysis, and in one subgroup of patients called PD-L1 positive subgroup, they found that it was significant. And so they said, okay, it may not be useful for all patients, but for this subgroup, it will be useful. They got it approved. I was not happy. We wrote this paper in JAMA Oncology saying, no, this is not the right way. And actually, they did a confirmatory trial. And in the confirmatory trial, this benefit, even in that subgroup, vanished. So it was a false positive finding. And now this drug has been revoked. Its approval has been withdrawn. But this is just an example to show how we can use subgroup analysis, unplanned subgroup analysis, or even sometimes planned subgroup analysis to give false positive results. So how did we arrive here? Why are all these problems happening? I think there is a big role of experts, media, and lack of education. Let's talk about experts. There is no good definition of what expertise means or who is an expert. During the time of COVID, we saw several experts. As you can see here, at the time, Kelly and Conway were saying this is COVID-19, not COVID-1. It goes both ways. One is, people with no expertise claiming themselves to be expert and saying, fake things, false things. And in this era of social media, you should also be careful because it goes both ways. Sometimes people who say genuine things, they can also be labeled as, this is fake. And this is a joke, but people say that if Galileo was alive in the era of Twitter and he said the earth revolves around the sun, the Twitter would say this claim is disputed by theology experts. Nowadays, you can see that if you write something, sometimes Twitter says this claim is disputed, this is fake. So even Galileo would have received that small badge from Twitter saying this is not true. So in case of oncology, of course, people who write editorials for these major RCTs in major journals, we think they are the real experts. And we try to see whether they have any conflict of interest about the drug that they are writing the editorial about. So we check if they have any conflict of interest and direct conflict of interest. Direct conflict of interest means having received money from the exact same company whose drug they are writing the editorial about. And we saw that if they have direct conflict of interest, they were significantly likely to write an unduly favorable editorial for the drug being discussed. Now, it's a problem with the publication system, with the journals. If you want someone to write an editorial about the trial, at least don't get someone who is getting money from the exact same company whose drug is being discussed. There are other people. And in fact, this paper that Dr. Booth led, of which I was also a part, this looks at a small cohort of physicians in the US who received industry payments of more than $100,000 a year, more than $100,000 a year. This is a small group of medical oncologists, just 1% of all medical oncologists in the US. But their payment in total represents 37% of the total industry payments to all US medical oncologists. So these are the people who are writing editorials, who are in guideline committees, who are giving you CME lectures. Like the median value of payments, it's more than like normal people's salary from industry alone. So let's go to the role of media now. You'll hear news like this: remarkable therapy beats terminal breast cancer, from reputed sources. I'm not talking about fake media. This is like BBC. But we need to read beyond the headline. When I checked what this news article is about, I found that this is about one of these papers that was published in Nature Medicine, and it had received huge attention, 1945 arithmetic score, which is huge. But if you read the paper, this paper is actually about a patient, one patient. This is a case report that turned out into the headline of remarkable therapy beats terminal breast cancer. You will see this everywhere. Prostate cancer. This is the trial that was published in Lancet Oncology about a very sexy therapy called padaliporfin vascular targeted photodynamic therapy. What's not to like about it? Even the name is so long. And then the news was laser activated drug, a leap forward for prostate cancer treatment. Could be a game changer. Let's see what game changer it is. And of course, it had huge arithmetic. Everyone was talking about it. But this is the efficacy results. If you look here, the control arm is active surveillance. That means you don't have to do anything for these patients. That's the standard of care. And even then, if you look at what matters, metastasis, how many patients metastasized, and prostate cancer related death, the control arm, active surveillance, where you don't do anything, the number is 0. Like even if you don't do anything, nobody developed metastasis, nobody died of prostate cancer. There is no game to change. How is it a game changer? How can you improve on 0? So this is just common sense to me. I think this was the first paper where I realized, like, wow, the emperor is naked. Like, it does not make sense. You should just use common sense. I think this was the first paper. This was published in 2016 or 2015. That's when I realized that, wow, our discipline really lacks common sense. So if you contrast this situation with what's happening in LMICs, now this is data from my country, Nepal, where we looked at patients with acute leukemia. These are patients who can be cured using classical old cytotoxic cheap drugs. We found that 73% of our patients had to ask money for charity from the public, to borrow loans, and to sell their properties to afford these classical old cytotoxic drugs. So that's the huge contrast that we're having versus LMICs, which Dr. Booth will discuss more after here.
Thanks, Bishal. So just as we kind of move towards a conclusion, I guess just to summarize, the vision that Bishal and I have with this initiative in Common Sense Oncology is there. We have, two things that we hope for the cancer system. The first is that our treatments that make a big difference, we want to ensure that cancer systems globally enable all patients with cancer to get access to these treatments with large benefits that really work. And then the flip side of that is that we don't want to live or work in a health system that gives patients near the end of life a whole bunch of treatment that doesn't really help them and almost certainly causes harm. And so we've talked today about how we can try to recalibrate these priorities and steer this ship, which has gone a little bit off course. So this is a study published last year. Again, first author was Adam Fendaitis, but it comes out of work that Bishal and I do as members of the WHO Essential Medicine List Cancer Working Group, where we sit around tables in Geneva periodically to think of which new medicines should be deemed essential, should go on the essential medicine list, which by extension should be prioritized by ministries of health worldwide and provided in the context of universal health care. And so we went to the front lines and we asked oncologists worldwide, which medicines do you think are most important for patient care? And can you actually get these in your own context? So we used the desert island thought experiment, and I'm sure some of you had played at dinner parties before. If you're moving to a desert island, it could only bring 5 books. What would those books be? If you were going to a hoedown and wanted to go country dancing with anyone in the world except for Dr. Frank, who would that be? So, these experiments that I'm sure all of us have played many times. So this was the experiment here. We asked the survey respondents, imagine your government has put you in charge of selecting anti-cancer medicines for your country. You are only allowed to select a maximum of 10 medicines to treat all cancers. Which drugs would you recommend to the government to achieve the greatest benefit for the most patients? Assume that cost is not an issue. And so we ended up with almost 1,000 respondents from oncologists in 82 countries. About a third of them were from lower middle and upper middle income countries. And when we looked at the drugs that were most commonly put in that suitcase to go to the desert island, and we ranked them, and there was 20 drugs that were really commonly chosen to go off to the desert island. The reality is most of them are old chemotherapy and hormone drugs that have been around for 10, 20, 30 years. In fact, most of these were approved by the FDA before 2000. We found good convergence with the WHO list. So 19 of these most commonly reported 20 drugs were on the EML. And there was convergence. Oncologists, regardless of where they work in the world, high income, low income, middle income, largely agreed on which drugs really matter. And they are largely older drugs. Here's the rank order. You can see these are the workhorses of chemotherapy. Doxorubicin, the cornerstone of breast cancer medicine and some leukemias. Cisplatin, used in all sorts of cancers, solid tumors. Paclitaxel. You can see here, these are mostly older drugs. There's a few of the newer drugs on there, including a few new drugs that are very expensive. But it's the new drugs that have large benefits that made it on the list. So these oncologists are actually pretty pragmatic. The second part of the study, though, was very sobering. Worldwide access to these medicines, despite the fact most of them should be a few dollars per week, these are generic drugs, is abysmal. In very, very few countries are these drugs universally available. In fact, when we asked oncologists, can you give these drugs to patients? Most of them said, I can only do it with risk of catastrophic financial ruin, meaning that families and patients will sell property, go into debt for generations to get these drugs. So here's just a couple examples. You can see the top box, doxorubicin. This is for oncologists who work in low middle income countries. You can see that about a third of oncologists said they can give it to patients in the universal context with minimal cost. A third can deliver it, but with significant financial expense. And more than 1/4 of oncologists said, look, I can give it, but it will cause catastrophic ruin for my patient. Another drug, trastuzumab, Herceptin. This is the breast cancer drug that's now biosimilar. It's available as a biosimilar. And so again, only 15% of oncologists globally can access this medicine universally for women with breast cancer. This is a really important drug. Likewise, 2/3 of oncologists said they can only give it with catastrophic ruinous expense. The really important thing here is trastuzumab is like the first generation HER2 drug in breast cancer. There are now many, many other drugs coming out, some of which look better than trastuzumab, but how collectively, and this is something we grapple with at the WHO, how can we contemplate adding these new drugs to the list when our global movement is failing to ensure that these fundamental core drugs are even available? So I guess the last concept, just to touch on before Bishal wraps up, is this tension between moonshot and ground shot research. So moonshot research we need. It is high-tech aspirational science that will help us understand pathways and design treatments for patients in 5, 10, 20 years. Some of those interventions and experiments will work, some of them will fail. Often they will provide treatment to some patients who live in some generally affluent countries. The problem right now is the current research ecosystem is entirely pushed on the moonshot paradigm. And what we've argued for is not to abandon moonshot research. We need that for treatments of tomorrow, but we need to better calibrate the balance to work on ground shot research, which is implementing what we already know. And we could probably will undoubtedly have a much larger public health benefit across all areas of medicine if we ensure that all patients have access to the stuff that we already know works. And so this is health systems research, implementation research, quality of care research. And so we need to better balance moonshot aspirational science with research on the ground. The last thought I'll share with you before Bishal wraps up is this concept that I call the last 6 months of life paradox. And I'm sure even in your own disciplines, you can have a similar paradox in mind. And this is that I look after patients with advanced GI cancer. Most of my patients have terminal disease. And it's quite common when I'm looking after someone the last 6 months of life, if they want to continue on active treatment, it's fairly easy for me to prescribe a drug that will cost $100,000. It might shrink tumors on a CAT scan for a period of time. It likely will not help them live longer, and it'll have side effects. So that's pretty standard practice in our health system. But as you all know, during that same time, for that same patient who lives alone, terminal, vulnerable patient, sick, and isolated, it's almost impossible for me to find the resources to keep them at home with adequate nursing care, companionship, and good food. And how is it possible that we live in a health system where we can provide one but not the other? And so I think the oncology community, there is incredible talent, creativity, and energy in all areas of medicine. I think we need to just shift things to enable people to work on these really pressing issues so that we actually can deliver care that really matters. So Bishal, now I'll call you up to wrap up.
So in this, going back to this paper that we wrote, we discussed that how can we address this common sense issue in oncology. And we identified three major themes. We need to have some actions related to delivery of care, education, and research and policy. And we discussed these common sense solutions related to research and policy. How should our research paradigm be changed, and how can we recalibrate our goals? What actions can we take in terms of delivery of care? But I would like to highlight more on education, because that, I think, is the fundamental pillar of how we can drive change. And education is, we need to educate our trainees more as well as the public more, because a lot of the issues that we have discussed, I think, boils down to lack of awareness and lack of critical thinking. And not just physician education, we need to focus on patient education as well, because patients are the major stakeholders of trials, of receipt of care. So if patients can be the driving force, then that can lead to changes. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking Chris. It's really my big honor that I'm sharing this stage with him today. This is a photo that I took of a slide he showed in the Nepal e-cancer meeting. We were there 2 weeks ago for a critical appraisal course to spread education. And as you can see in the slide, he mentions Dai and Bhai. That's a Nepali word. Dai means elder brother. Bhai means younger brother. So when Chris showed this slide in Nepal, it was a really touching moment for me, because Chris is the main reason why I'm here in Queens. And we have been working on these common sense issues, first separately and nowadays together for a while. So it means a lot to me that I'm working with him, and I can call him Dai. I can call him a mentor. And we get to work together. We get to work on these concepts together, this research together. And it's not easy to find Dais like him, with whom you share so many philosophies. So so thank you everyone for attending this Dai-Bhai Show. But if you have any questions, or if you're disagreeing with anything that I have said, it's all his fault. Wake him up and ask him. Thank you.
Well, that's a wonderful talk. And for the young people in the audience, I can tell you that's 100% true. And there's an old expression in American politics, which is it's hard to get a man to understand something he's paid not to understand. So if you're looking for the source of the problem, it's us in the medical profession. So I just pulled up, you asked, and we'll open it up for chat and questions, but you asked if there were similar things in other fields. So in the field of pulmonary hypertension, oops, I screwed this up already. There was a paper published on macitentan in the New England Journal of Medicine, and I'll just read you. So this is a drug that costs, in the $20,000 range. So basically, the primary endpoint of this study of a drug for pulmonary hypertension was death, atrial septotomy, lung transplant, blah, 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 blah. And the study concludes that this drug significantly reduced morbidity and mortality, except when you look at table 1, there were no differences in the number of deaths. So they actually cynically termed the word mortality to mean if any of these things happen, that's mortality. And some of us wrote editorials about that, and it's interesting that you immediately become persona non grata. The only thing I would disagree with in your talk is I do think we need more moonshots, because a lot of these drugs actually have no chance of curing anything. You can actually prove that in a basic science lab, like they don't work. There is no way, I don't understand how they get to the point of being trialed, because they're not curative in rats or any preclinical trial. And I think too often, if a drug company owns it, it gets tested. When those of us that develop drugs actually, and you can tell that I've been down this road for many years, when you actually develop a drug yourself that actually might work, if there's no money, if there's not a bag of money behind it, it will not get tested by clinical trials groups or industry. So we'll open it up. Dr. Abdullah has a question. I'm going to run up to him, and then we'll go to the chat next for a question. And maybe we'll go to Dr. Hay after Dr. Abdullah, and then we'll go to the chat.
this is probably the most important rounds I have attended in the last 2 years. And I think, to me, this should be repeated, should be seminars about this. Unfortunately, I feel that we are defeated. And the central point here for me is that unfettered, unregulated system, economic system we live under, and the healthcare system, the research has all been a vehicle for profit. As long as so this is my comment, because I think if you look what's happening in the world, things are getting worse. And I think they will continue like that. And I don't know whether anything will happen to change. Because the moment you take something from the lab, which probably costs you maybe $2,000 and you get $2 billion from it, that's not good to change. The other thing, my question is that you didn't touch on the role of patient advocacy and the guideline writers who are driving us nuts about efficacy of these drugs, about efficacy of this treatment, particularly at the end, the 6 months of life. To me, this is really a cancer of medical care.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Hoshi, for those kind comments and a very profound insight. You're right. I mean, there is too much money at stake. The patient advocates, it's interesting. I mean, you know, some of the groups are funded heavily by the pharmaceutical industry. That's where they're getting their information. But I've noticed a change in the last 5 years. There's increasingly a number of very vocal, highly educated patient groups that are saying enough. They're the ones now going to the FDA meetings. And instead of saying we want more drugs faster, they're saying, no, wait, we want drugs with real benefit faster. And they're starting to push back. So I've actually pivoted kind of my approach in the last few years to try to have more engagement with patient groups and public, because I think that's where oncologists have lost the forest for the trees. And I think we need to go back to the core business, which is patients and the public. One thing I will say about the drug prices, not many people realize this, and it still blows my mind every time I think about this, but in the early 1990s, legislation was passed in the US Congress and Senate, which I'm going to paraphrase this. Essentially, the FDA, its mandate is to approve a drug if there's any sliver of benefit compared to an old drug, okay? And then the next part of that piece is said, once the FDA approves it, Medicare and Medicaid must provide it for all people over the age of 65 on Medicaid in the US, and they are forbidden by law to negotiate price. It's unbelievable. I can't believe the American people tolerate this.
You're just not old enough. So, I mean, there was a time actually when the FDA, like 20 years ago, actually turned down lots of drugs, and they got tremendous political pressure. They were becoming an obstacle to the approval of drugs, and that came from us, we, the medical profession in the United States, where I was working at the time, and from patients. And so basically, the FDA used to be a gate, and now it's an open door. Yeah. So that's the problem with advocacy, is it can have unintended consequences. Now, Dr. Gyawali, why don't you come up as well, and Gyawali, and just so we can you can both answer questions as they come up. Dr. Hay?
Oh, hi, and thank you both. Yeah, we could spend a week discussing all of this. Focusing on one point, I wonder if you would consider adding to your cancer ground shot, looking at approved therapies that we know work, but where we're fairly confident we could give reduced doses or time-limited therapy, saving patients huge amount of toxicity and saving the healthcare system like hundreds of thousands per patient. And clearly industry are not motivated to test these because it would result in a profit loss. Academics are desperately trying in many areas, but it is so hard to get the funding to do these trials for deprescribing. Can we together as a community advocate more strongly for that approach, which would help globally?
Is that Dr. Gyawali or Dr. Gyawali?
Oh, the team, the world, come on in.
Why don't we go to Dr. Gyawali and then Dr. Booth can follow up, and then
that's a really important point, and that is a point that we started to work on. And there are a group of people. Actually, they have coined a new discipline called interventional pharmacoeconomics. People like Daniel Goldstein and Mark Rathen and Ian Tannock, they have championed this field. And I absolutely agree. There is so much opportunity there, especially with regards to like immunotherapy. I call it the imprecision of immunotherapy. I think we are treating too many patients for too long time at too frequent intervals at too high a dose. So there are several opportunities for dose reduction in frequency, and reduction of the duration. I don't think everybody needs to be treated at such high dose forever until disease progression. So there is tremendous opportunity. With everyone, we have seen that giving high fatty meal will allow us to give a lower dose and still have the same beneficial effects. But there is obviously not going to be industry interest in this. So there needs to be lots of public funding to support this type of trials, but I absolutely support this.
Yeah, just to echo that, I mean, some people in the audience may not know, but Dr. Hay is one of the leading clinical trialists in our field globally, and we're lucky here in Kingston to have the headquarters of the Canadian Cancer Trials Group. And so, we've been critical of some elements of randomized trials in our field, and actually that's led to a movement largely in the US that we can abandon the RCT and just give a new drug to like 40 people, and then if the tumor shrink, approve it. And that is, the completely wrong approach. There's nothing wrong with randomized controlled trials. In fact, it's the most beautiful, innovation in medicine, because we can test treatments and actually know if they work. They're just being designed in a way to game the system. And that's where we need to reinvest in academic cooperative groups like the CTG and look to government and other sources of funding so we can answer questions that matter. It always blows my mind to think that Ontario spends $1 billion a year on cancer medicines, $1 billion a year. But, the Ministry of Health essentially invests no money to understand how are these interventions being deployed? Do they work in the real world? Could we have a small amount of that to understand how do we de-escalate care, reduce dose intensity, et cetera, which will help patients and save money?
Just before we go to Dr. Frank, there are a couple of comments. Dr. Ellis commented on, is it essentially, I think the implication of Anne's question is, the PI and the treating physician are the same person in a clinical trial. Is that not a conflict of interest? So if you're the PI on a study and you're actually administering, is that a problem? And someone else is asking, is it also an issue that apply these conflicts of interest that you're talking about? Are they also true in radiation oncology and other areas of oncology, or if it's just medical oncology that's the problem? And then we'll go to Dr. Frank.
I think it's pervasive in oncology. I think the issue is that one of those first slides, the money is in the drugs. And so, it's actually crazy when we go to these international meetings. What actually cures most patients with cancer? It's not drugs. It's surgery and radiotherapy. But we've just published a study that shows that 92% of clinical trials in the world are all drug trials, because that's where the money is. What about, palliative care, prevention, early diagnosis, all these really, really important core parts of cancer. And it gets back to Hoshi's point, which is that there's too much money in the system. There's too much money in the system.
I was just thinking, if you've ever seen the film The Fugitive, you guys might want to start taking out bodyguards. I was just going to make the comment that you mentioned about those difficult discussions about toxicity and kind of what you live with and how much extra time you get. Just for, I think, all clinicians, but particularly young clinicians, rather than reading Being Mortal, I really highly recommend the PBS Frontline documentary Being Mortal, which is 45 minutes, which is much more doable, but has some really nice examples of not only the philosophy behind some of those discussions, but some practical examples for people to model in clinical care.
Thanks, Chris.
One thing that's interesting is the way this criticism is received. So you talked about, I think it was Dr. Gyawali was talking about the money that goes to a small group of oncologists. So if you're in the business class section of an airplane, because of your research, oops, obviously we're being bugged. So if you're in the business class section of an airplane because of your research, you probably are being supported by industry. And so some in the field I'm in pulmonary hypertension, so forgetting them, there's no money in mitochondria. So if you might have a conflict of interest, but no one cares. But if you go to the pulmonary hypertension side, all those New England Journal trials, you usually can't actually get those authors to even reiterate what that trial shows. So the trials are fundamentally flawed. They're funded by, like the macitentan trial is funded by the company that makes macitentan. The statistical analysis in the trials, I pointed out in an editorial, is actually done by the company that made the drug that sponsored the trial. And a lot of the authors are authors solely because they enrolled the most patients. I mean, it's that flawed and that transparent. And unfortunately, when you point that out, even if you do it with a smile on your face, people don't like that because they're famous. And they, if you look at their H indices and their impact in the field, they're famous because they do those trials, but they didn't design them, they didn't analyze them, and they didn't actually write them. Like a lot of these trials in the New England Journal are actually written by the companies who actually employ authors. So unfortunately, we, the medical profession, are the problem because you could easily absent yourself from that and do what you're doing. But other questions in the, Gavin, and then there's one where? Okay, we'll go online in a second. Dr. Winston has a question or comment.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I was interested about this situation where you have someone in the last months of life for whom an expensive treatment is available, but probably has a very minimal benefit. I was wondering if there's any evidence or research about why patients choose to pursue that treatment. Is it that the physicians are presenting perhaps it in a more positive light than reality, or is it the data has been presented and the patient isn't able to understand it because these figures are very difficult to understand? Or is it truly that they do want, having carefully considered, to pursue that treatment?
A great question. I think it's the core driver of a lot what happens. And I think everything you said, the answer is everything you said. So I think, these are vulnerable, scared patients who are clinging to hope. Some of that hope has probably been driven by media perception, what they're hearing about fight the cancer narrative from their friends and family, well-meaning advice. Some of it is perhaps oncologists don't do a good job having these conversations and clearly articulating how big or how small the benefit might be. And then also there's kind of a human nature where people often assume they'll be the exception and hope that they'll do better than the numbers would suggest. But I think it's a lot of those things. What I've done is I've gotten more comfortable in my practice over the years is be very, very upfront and honest about the limitations of things and try to not use confusing language. And, it's not my job to tell a patient if they're making a wise or an unwise decision. Everyone has their own values and preferences, but I think we don't do a good job of presenting them with the information to empower those decisions. And so I think a lot has to do with communication.
Dr. Hamad has a question.
Yeah, thanks. I have a question for Chris and Bishal. I think one thing that we need to add is the effect on workload and workforce issues, especially with increasing burnout and the time you really need to spend with patients. And I think this has been overlooked in terms of how we are now, even though in Canada we're doing better than the US, but we always feel obliged to look for drugs on compassionate basis, and these need a lot of paperwork, a lot of more visits for the patients, a lot of time that's taken away from doing our internal medicine job of looking at symptoms and managing them and dealing with the existential issues for the patient. So I would say I think there's a workload toxicity that's actually on the other side that needs to be studied and kind of incorporated into this narrative for common sense. So are there any thoughts about that? How would we go about that? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. Totally agree. Like one of the reasons why we are treating patients until the very end of life is also because we are so burdened with workload, and having a discussion about palliative care, about risks and benefits, and saying probably this may not be in your best interest, it takes time. And people, it's much more easier and faster to say, you know what, your disease has progressed, let's try a new drug. It's much easier to say that. It's much more comfortable to say that than to have the uncomfortable but right approach of actually going through the treatment options and deciding that it may or may not be in the patient's best interest. And this workload toxicity is especially acute in low and middle income countries. We talked about global oncology as well. In several parts of the world, people are seeing hundreds of patients in one clinic. And in that situation, it's all the more difficult to properly take care of all the patient's needs. So that is a problem. I don't know how to address that problem well, but one approach that we are doing right now in Nepal is we are trying to copy the model of Canada about GPO, general practitioners in oncology. And we are trying to train family physicians in Nepal. We are trying to deliver 1 year of curriculum in basics of oncology so that they can deliver care at remote parts of the country, coordinating with a medical oncologist. But yeah, it is a problem, and I cannot think of any easy solutions.
There were some nice comments as well about whether we should have the equivalent of an antimicrobial stewardship model for cancer, which I think is basically saying, no, you can't have this drug. These are the drugs we use for this. And so we could go on. I think this has been a wonderful rounds, and it does relate to sort of the personal integrity and responsibility of physicians. Because the funny thing is, like, as a cardiologist, I can tell you Gleevec works because I have patients that have CML that are not dying that used to die. So you don't need a randomized clinical trial when the drug actually works. I mean, you need it to get it approved, but you don't need it to see it in practice. And the funny thing is, it is nice to sort of open the cloak and actually see what's going on from your perspective. We could open our cardiology cloaks and show you the same clay feet, but thank you for opening our eyes. And I guess it's a reminder for the next generation of physicians coming, don't be bought off, do be critical, do read clinical trials critically, and actually be an active participant and not afraid to speak up and try to present at least your version of the truth, so that we don't wind up in some of these situations that we currently find ourselves in. So we'll put you in the witness protection program, and thank you for your honesty. It is interesting, if you look at the rounds we've had in the last few days in the Department of Medicine, if you look at the rounds we've had in the last few days, we've talked about some fairly controversial issues. And again, it's just a reminder, the purpose of universities is to be a place to actually debate controversial ideas and provide a safe space for people talking about who's got the patient. Are we actually all biased by the design of our clinical trials? So thank you for challenging us. It was a wonderful talk. And it's nice to also see the friendship, which ultimately, for those of you thinking about a career in research, is the pleasure of research, is doing it with someone else and actually having the fun of talking about it and enjoying it and traveling around the world, thinking about it with colleagues. So thanks for wonderful rounds.